Around 1200 years before the Common Era, a whole network of civilizations, from Greece all the way to Egypt, fell apart. It happened in a single lifetime. Historian Cline says it was arguably the worst disaster in ancient history. That was the late Bronze Age collapse. But the story isn't just about invasion. It's more complex than that, and it feels relevant. There was a domino effect, a cascade of failures, all interconnected. It toppled a globalized world. A changing climate sparked famine, then trade routes shattered, and that crippled armies, and there were these mysterious seafaring groups. They accelerated the chaos. It's a cautionary tale. It's about systemic fragility, a lesson written in ancient dust, and it speaks directly to now, to our own interconnected age. What does it feel like when the entire world you know begins to fall apart? The late Bronze Age was a world of connections. Borders were there, but people crossed them constantly. Great kingdoms separated by huge distances. They knew each other, they spoke, they traded, they signed treaties. Royal families sent their daughters to marry foreign kings, to seal alliances. It was this web, a web of diplomacy and commerce stretching from Egypt to the Aegean. You had the Hittite Empire in what's now Turkey, a military power. Egypt under pharaohs like Ramesses II, incredibly wealthy, building monuments. And across the sea, the Mycenaean Greeks, in their fortified palaces at Mycenae, Pylos. Their influence was everywhere, and then smaller states, crucial ones, Ugarit, a busy port, the wealthy merchants on Cyprus. What held it together was flow. Goods, ideas moving all the time. The most important trade was in raw materials, tin and copper. You needed both to make bronze. Copper came from Cyprus. Tin came from incredibly far away from Afghanistan. To make this work, they used a common language for diplomacy, a form of Akkadian written on clay tablets. Kings called each other brother in their letters. They exchanged gifts, gold, ivory, fine cloth, chariots. We know this network was real, not just from texts. There's proof at the bottom of the sea. Off the coast of Turkey, there's a wreck, the Uluburan ship. It sank around 1300 BCE. Its cargo was like a snapshot of the whole economy. Copper ingots from Cyprus, tin, ebony from Egypt, glass from Mesopotamia, amber from the Baltic Sea, even a gold scarab with the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. That ship was a hub connecting continents. This system created stability. For centuries, it was a kind of golden age, but that stability created its own fragility. These kingdoms became interdependent, like dominoes standing close together. The palaces were the center of everything. They controlled production, storage, distribution. Their wealth and power depended completely on those long trade routes working smoothly, on the steady exchange of letters and gifts. They had built a world optimized for prosperity under very specific conditions. They had built a house of cards, beautiful, complex, and vulnerable to a single gust of wind. The first tremor, it wouldn't come from an army, it would come from the sky. That gust of wind started as a whisper in the trees, a whisper of thirst. The first domino wasn't human, it was the climate. Evidence from tree rings, from lakebed sediment, shows a picture. Starting around 1250 BC, a dryness settled over the eastern Mediterranean. This wasn't a few bad years, it was a megadrought. It stretched for generations. The lifeblood of these empires was grain, wheat and barley. The whole palace system, the armies, the artisans, it was built on agricultural surplus. A few poor years you could manage from reserves. But when the rain doesn't come year after year, the Hittite fields baked hard, the fertile plains for Egypt, their yields withered. Even in Mycenaean Greece, the olive groves, the grapevines, they would have struggled. The science suggests a cause, a shift in atmospheric patterns, what they call the North Atlantic Oscillation. it may have diverted the rain-bearing storms away. Some data points to volcanic eruptions too, ash and sulfur in the upper atmosphere, dimming the sun, disrupting weather for years. The result was the same. A systemic drought. The stress on societies was immediate. A centralized economy can't function without its primary resource. Grain stores dwindled, prices would have soared. Malnutrition spread, and the illnesses that follow. For the kings, this was more than a crisis. It was a catastrophe. Their power was tied to feeding people, paying workers in grain, supplying armies. A king who can't provide bread loses his mandate. The social contract begins to fray. This environmental shock was the first crack, a silent, creeping pressure. It made everything that followed not just possible but almost inevitable. Hunger is a quiet kind of revolution. The drought got worse, and the fields that used to feed empires just turned to dust. Then came the famine. That was the second thing to fall, and it made people move. Across that ancient world, the most basic human drive took over, just to survive. You can see it in these letters between kings. There's a tablet from Ugarit sent to the king of Cyprus. It's a stark plea. It's begging for a shipment of grain, a lifeline. We don't have the reply. We don't know if help ever came or if it was just silence because other kingdoms were guarding their own stores. This scarcity set off a powerful force. Historians call it subsistence migration. It's not an invasion, not in the usual sense. It's whole communities moving, not for conquest, but just for food. Families, clans, villages they had to choose. Stay and face what comes, or gather what they had and move toward where they heard there was plenty. They became climate refugees, walking away from their homes, leaving villages empty for good. That movement created a ripple. Think of a region already struggling to feed itself. Then on its borders, thousands of new mouths appear. They're desperate, armed with nothing but the need to live. They're not an army, but their presence is a siege. The local grain, the water, the pasture, it's all under new strain. Tensions flared. A conflict over a well, over a harvest could turn violent. The social fabric, woven over generations, started to tear. And here, the foundation of Bronze Age power cracked. The palace system, those godlike kings, their authority was built on a promise. The promise to provide. In good times, the ruler was the provider, distributing grain from the storehouses. In return, people gave their labor and loyalty. But when the storehouses were empty, that contract broke. A king who couldn't feed his people wasn't a protector anymore. He was a failure. Trust evaporated. Local leaders, maybe even soldiers, might seize what was left. The centralized state, already weak from drought, now faced collapse from within. Order didn't just fade. It was pushed to the breaking point by the footsteps of the hungry, looking for a meal that wasn't there. A hungry world stops trading. That was the third domino. Those long supply lines, they shattered. The whole Bronze Age economy, it ran on this ancient version of just-in-time delivery. Copper came from Cyprus. Tin came from Afghanistan. These weren't luxuries, they were absolute necessities. You needed them to make bronze, and bronze was the material of civilization. Every sword, every spear point, every tool, it all started with that alloy, and these materials traveled thousands of miles, over land, over sea, through a network of trusted merchants along protected routes. That whole system assumed stability, it assumed safe passage. The drought and the famine broke that assumption, broke it completely. Overland caravans became targets. Roads that were once secure, they swarmed with bandits, and those bandits were often just desperate people. People pushed to the edge, but the real danger moved to the water. The Mediterranean, that great highway of commerce, it became a hunting ground. We see them in the letters from the time, the frantic letters. Egyptian records call them the Sea Peoples. But that's a catch-all term. They weren't a single nation. They were likely a mix. displaced coastal communities, opportunistic pirates, entire groups on the move by boat. If your farm has failed and the king's storehouse is empty, the sea might be your only option, so they took to ships, not for exploration, for survival. And a laden merchant vessel, slow and heavy with copper ingots, that was the perfect prize. The effect was a total breakdown. Think of a modern supply chain. Then imagine every shipping lane becoming too dangerous to use. The raw materials just stopped arriving. A palace like Pylos in Greece, it had the artisans. It had the workshops, the designs for magnificent bronze goods, but without the tin and copper, those workshops fell silent. This had a multiplier effect. A catastrophic one. First, it crippled military power. You cannot equip an army without bronze. A king facing unrest or an external threat, he'd find his armories dwindling. His soldiers might have to fight with repaired weapons, older weapons, or worse, not fight at all. Second, it destroyed the economic glue, the glue of international relations. Diplomacy was gift exchange. A new pharaoh in Egypt, he'd send lavish bronze vessels, gold-trimmed weapons, to his brother kings in Hittite or Mycenaean. This wasn't just generosity, it was a political transaction, a reaffirmation of status and alliance. When you can't produce those goods anymore, you can't play the game. The letters between kings grew more strained, the gifts stopped flowing. The language of brotherhood, it began to sound hollow, especially when you couldn't secure the tin to make a worthy present. That whole cultural and political web, it was woven through exchange, and it began to unravel, thread by thread. The palaces were isolated then, growing weaker by the day. Listening to the silence where the trade ships used to be, the silence on the trade routes ended. You started hearing oars on the water, and that brought the fourth domino. A force so devastating, the Egyptians gave it a name, the Sea Peoples. That name echoes through history. Their story is written in stone, on the walls of Pharaoh Ramesses III's temple at Medinet Habu. The carvings show a naval battle, total chaos, strange ships with high prows, warriors in feathered headdresses fighting from the decks, and others attacking from land, in ox-drawn carts, with their families right there beside them. This isn't a professional army. This is a picture of a people on the move, fighting for a place to land. For a long time, history saw them as the cause. A barbarian horde that swept in and destroyed everything. But the modern understanding is different, more nuanced, and in some ways more frightening. They were less a cause and more a symptom, the final accelerant thrown onto a fire that was already burning. So who were they? The Egyptian records list names. The Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyen. These aren't a single nation, it's a confederation, a coalition of different groups from all around the crumbling world. Archaeologists piece together their origins from pottery, from burial styles, some from the Aegean Islands, others from the coast of Anatolia, maybe Sardinia, Sicily. They were likely a mix, displaced farmers whose lands had failed, skilled sailors turned to piracy, warrior bands from frontiers where authority had vanished. They weren't a unified invasion force with a plan. They were a wave, human desperation and ambition channeled by the sea. Their power was in their timing. They arrived when the great kingdoms were at their weakest, isolated by broken trade, straining under internal famine. They didn't attack Egypt or Hittite head-on, not at first. They targeted the vulnerable points in the network. The port city of Ugarit was one of the first to fall. Its destruction was sudden. Archaeologists found a clay tablet in the city's kiln, ready to be fired. A frantic message from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus. He writes that the enemy ships are already here, that his own troops and chariots are away. That the city is defenseless. He pleads for help. That tablet was never sent. The city was sacked and burned, ruins so complete it was never rebuilt. The Sea Peoples moved like a storm surge, overwhelming one weakened point after another. They didn't just destroy cities, they severed the last threads of that international system. They made the seas impassable, finalizing the economic isolation that was already choking the palaces, and in doing that, they transformed a slow-motion crisis into a sudden, catastrophic event. They were the spark that landed in the tinderbox. The king's power was a promise, and the promise was written in grain. When the grain ran out, the promise broke, and when that broke, everything else broke too. This was the internal revolt. The palaces didn't just face enemies from outside. They faced a collapse from within. The whole system was a pyramid. The king was at the top. In Mycenaean Greece, he was the wanax more than a ruler. Almost a divine figure, his palace was the economic heart. It collected the harvest, stored it in giant jars, then redistributed food and wool and bronze to the workers, the soldiers, the artisans. That was the deal. People gave their labor and loyalty. The wanax gave security and sustenance, a fragile equilibrium. Then the drought came, the storehouses emptied. The redistribution system faltered. A king who can't feed his people, his divine right starts to seem very human, very flawed. His legitimacy, the glue of society, it began to dissolve. You can see the fear in the stones. In the final decades, they didn't just build higher walls against invaders. They fortified the interior. At places like Gla and Turin's, they built massive walls to cut the citadel off from the lower town. Why do that? It points to a new reality. The greatest threat might not be from a distant sea. It might be from your own starving population, right outside your gate. The rulers were barricading themselves in, not just from foreign armies, from their own people. The written records from that final hour are haunting. The linear bead tablets from Pylos, they were baked hard in the fire that destroyed the palace. They capture a state in its death throes, their administrative lists. But they read like panic. One tablet orders coast watchers to guard the shoreline, a tiny force, just a handful of men for miles of coast. It shows a kingdom stretched so thin it can barely watch its own borders. Another tablet mentions a gift of gold to the gods, a desperate plea for divine intervention when human power had clearly failed. The bureaucracy was still functioning. Scribes were still recording, but the reality they documented was one of dwindling resources and rising terror. Then the social contract shattered. When the central authority could no longer provide or protect, people stopped looking upward to the palace. They looked to whoever could offer safety: local strongmen, military commanders, tight-knit communities. They seized control of what little remained. They fortified their own villages, guarded their own grain stores, cut ties with the distant, failing king. The unified kingdom fragmented into a patchwork of scared, isolated pockets. The wanax became irrelevant. The pyramid of power didn't topple from a single blow. It crumbled from the base upward as each layer stopped believing in the layer above. The palace, once the source of all life, became just another building waiting for the end. The silence in those bronze workshops, it meant something. The great kingdoms were struggling to find tin and copper, but up in the highlands away from the palaces, they were working with something else: iron. For a long time, it was just a curiosity, a ceremonial metal, more precious than gold because it was so difficult to shape. But during the collapse, its advantages became clear. Iron ore was everywhere. You could find it in common hills. It wasn't locked away on some distant island controlled by a king. Smelting it took skill. It needed very hot fires, but it didn't require a supply chain stretching thousands of miles. This was a shift, a technological shift with deep social consequences. It broke the monopoly on bronze. In the old world, power was forged through control of tin. Control the trade routes, and you control the means of war. Iron changed that. A local chieftain could do it, a village leader, a band of warriors. If they had the knowledge, they could produce their own weapons. They didn't need to ask a failing palace. They didn't need to wait for a merchant ship that might never come. This didn't cause the collapse, not directly. The empires were already falling when iron began to rise, but it made them irrelevant. It shaped the chaotic world that came after. Think of a giant, weakened and staggering. And the people around him discover they can make their own tools now, their own swords without his permission. His leverage just evaporates. We see this in the archaeology. In the ruins of burned palaces, you find bronze spear points, bent and broken. But in the simpler settlements that came later, you find iron. It's crude at first. Often worse than good bronze, but it's there, and it's local. That's military asymmetry. The old powers were fighting a new kind of conflict with a broken, centralized system. Their enemies, whether they were sea peoples or rebels, were increasingly armed with a technology that was decentralized by nature. The age of the god-king was ending. His divinity proven by his control of rare materials. A new age was being hammered out on anvils far from the throne rooms, an age where power could be built from the ground up. From the earth itself, the Bronze Age didn't end with a single battle. It ended when the recipe for power was rewritten. The great kings used to speak. They wrote on clay tablets and sent them across the world. It was a system of rules and rituals. They called each other brother. They married each other's daughters. They sent gifts: gold, ivory, linen. A gift was a symbol. It showed your place in the order of things. We have these letters found in Egypt, the Amarna letters. Pharaohs writing to Babylon, to Hatti, to Mycenaean. The tone is formal, but it's familiar. One king complains about the quality of gold he received. Another asks about a promised princess. It's a conversation among equals. They shared a language, Akkadian. They shared a way of doing things. This was their system for peace. It settled small conflicts. It smoothed over trade. It was a channel for aid, but the system needed trust. And when scarcity comes, trust goes first. The droughts got worse, famines spread. And the language in the letters changed. Polite requests turned to urgent demands. The gifts stopped coming. No one would send their last grain away. A letter asking for help might go unanswered for months, or it might never get a reply. That silence was an answer. The brotherhood was breaking. Without that constant talk, without the gifts and the marriages, the whole framework fell apart. A border skirmish used to be settled by scribes. Now there was no referee. A fight over water or a trade route could just escalate. There was no one to appeal to. The international order collapsed, so a local crisis, a rebellion or a raid couldn't be contained anymore. It would spill over the border, and the kingdom next door, already isolated, would see it as a threat. A direct threat. They would respond with force, not with words. That's how the domino effect started. The failure to talk turned regional trouble into a continental disaster. The last letters tell the story. They're not about alliance or trade. They're cries for help. A king writes, "My cities are burning. The enemy is here. Send your armies." We don't have a reply to that. All we have is the ash, the ruins. The network that once spread prosperity began to spread collapse. When the language of brotherhood died, the only language left was the sword. The silence afterward wasn't just quiet. It was a kind of forgetting. Across those burned places, something final happened. People walked away from their cities and they didn't return. That was the eighth domino, leaving the cities behind, and with that, losing writing itself. Take Hattusa, the Hittite capital. For centuries, it was this wonder. A fortified city of temples and palaces, built into a mountainside in Turkey. It was the center of an empire. And then, around 1200, it was emptied. The evidence shows it wasn't a panic. It was organized. They took what they could carry. They even took the statues of their gods out of the temples. Then they left the gates open and the wind moved in. No one ever came back to live there. The city turned into a ghost, walls slowly crumbling, taken back by grass and stone. That same pattern happened from Greece to the Levant. Pylos was burned, Mycenaean was abandoned, Ugarit was left in ruins. These weren't temporary, they were permanent. And this exodus had a terrifying effect. Literacy disappeared. In Mycenaean Greece, the palace scribes used a script called Linear B, a complex system just for administrative records. Lists of chariot wheels, textile workers, grain for the gods. When the palaces burned the scribes, this specialized class tied to that power, they were killed or scattered. The knowledge of how to read those symbols died with them. The same thing happened with cuneiform across Anatolia and the Near East. The clay tablets baked hard in the fires. They preserved the messages for us, but for the people after, those marks became just scratches. They lost the ability to read their own civilization's records. The result was a historical blackout, a dark age literally. In Greece for about 400 years there are almost no written records, a silence in the archaeology. It was a catastrophic loss of institutional knowledge, how to run a large state, how to coordinate long trade routes, advanced building techniques, even the recipes for pottery glazes or metal alloys. Those skills kept alive by the scribes and artisans of the palaces, they just faded away. Society shrank back to a smaller scale. Life became intensely local. Communities were based on village and clan, on oral stories, not on written decrees from a distant king. The psychological impact is hard to grasp. The link to the past was cut. Within a few generations, the people living among the huge, crumbling walls of Mycenae had no idea who built them. They told myths about giants, about a heroic age of greater men. The ruins became monuments to a forgotten time, sources of legend. The collapse wasn't just political or economic, it was a rupture in human continuity. The light of complex record-keeping went out, and for centuries memory was kept alive only by the fragile, changing thread of the spoken word. Mycenae is a ruin that speaks of power and then its sudden absence. This was the center of a civilization, and its fall shows that collapse in miniature. The Mycenaean world was a network of palaces, Mycenae, Pylos, Turins, Thebes. Each one a fortress on a hill, with walls of stone so huge later Greeks believed only giants could have built them. Inside, the Wanax ruled. He controlled a top-down economy. Everything moved through his storerooms: olive oil and wine, grain, bronze. Clay tablets kept track of it all. That system produced great art, luxury, military strength. But it was brittle. When the pressures came, the drought, the collapse of trade, this structure couldn't flex. It broke. The archaeology shows an internal fracture. At palace after palace, the final layer is intense fire, concentrated burning, but often there isn't much sign of a long siege from outside, not a lot of enemy arrowheads. Instead, you find signs of a society turning inward. At some sites, valuable things were hidden in a rush. Hoards of jewelry, bronze vessels, tucked into wall crevices or buried under palace floors. They were never recovered. That suggests panic, not an orderly retreat, maybe by the elite, who then didn't live to come back for their treasure. The fires were so hot they baked the clay tablets, preserving the last orders of the scribes. One from Pylos talks about watching the coast. It feels like a kingdom staring out at the sea, waiting for a threat, while the real danger was inside its own walls. Historians point out that stress, famine, scarcity would have made deep social divisions worse. The palace system created sharp hierarchies. A small elite lived well, supported by a large class of farmers, herders, artisans. When the system failed to deliver, that social contract broke. Resentment would have grown. It's possible local factions, military leaders, even oppressed communities saw the weakened palace not as a protector, but as a stockpile to take. The huge interior walls built in the final years, like the one at Turins that cut the citadel off from the lower town, hint at that fear. The rulers were barricading themselves against their own people. This internal unraveling gives a kind of resonance to the legends the later Greeks told about that era. The story of the Trojan War, written down by Homer centuries later, might be a distant, mythologized memory of that chaos. In the epic, a coalition of Greek kings sails to besiege a great city. they win, but the journey home is full of disaster. Kingdoms fall, heroes are lost, a golden age passes. It's a story of magnificent palaces meeting a catastrophic end. Troy was a real place, but the epic probably wove together memories of the sea peoples, of naval raids, of the stunning collapse of the Mycenaean world itself. The legend keeps the feeling of the time, a sense of lost grandeur, of a sophisticated world brought down not by a single enemy, but by a cascade of misfortune and strife. The Mycenaeans didn't just disappear, they broke apart from the inside, leaving behind silent stones and stories that became the foundation of Greek myth. The Hittite Empire was landlocked. It was a fortress, but it had no harbor, a superpower in the dry Anatolian highlands. Its strength was also its weakness. It couldn't feed itself. The plateau wasn't fertile enough, not for its population, not for its ambitions. So its survival depended on a lifeline, grain from the coasts. From Egypt, from provinces in the Levant like Syria, that was the bargain. Control the trade routes, and the bread baskets of others would fill your storehouses. But then the Megadrought came, and the bargain broke. The coastal regions were hit hard too. They had less surplus to send. The lifeline thinned, then it frayed. Hattusa, the capital, was a magnificent place perched on a remote, rocky plateau. It wasn't a city of farmers, it was bureaucrats, soldiers, priests. All fed by grain taxed from distant lands, and it needed those provinces for more than food. They provided troops, early warnings, a buffer zone, strategic depth. When the drought pushed people to move, that buffer dissolved. Displaced communities searching for food, they pressed against the frontiers. They were just moving a human tide. But their movement severed the overland routes. Caravans carrying grain couldn't get through. The roads became too dangerous. The provinces, struggling with their own famine, couldn't send troops or supplies. Hattusa was isolated, a brain cut off from its own limbs. You can hear the desperation in the final records. A letter from the Hittite queen to Rameses II of Egypt. She writes, "In my land there is famine. Send me grain so my people may live." It's a plea, not a request between equals. We don't know if the grain ever arrived. But even if it did, it was a temporary respite. The system itself had failed. The Hittite collapse is about overextension. They built a magnificent empire, but it wasn't resilient. It was optimized for control under stable conditions, not for survival under stress. Their power was a network of dependencies. When the network failed, the center had nothing. No local food, no defensible retreat. Their strategic depth vanished because depth requires loyal, functioning territories. In the end, the empire didn't fall in a glorious battle. It was starved. The people in Hattusa, facing empty storehouses and silent roads, they made a final decision. They gathered their most sacred objects, the statues of their gods, and they walked away. They left the gates open, a silent admission. The experiment of a landlocked superpower dependent on a world that no longer existed was over. Egypt was the one left standing. Everything else had fallen apart, but Egypt didn't disappear. It lasted, though lasting isn't the same as flourishing. Its story is that last domino. What resilience actually costs? Why did it hold on when the others didn't? It comes down to the river. The Nile flooded every single year. It left this rich, black silt all across the valley. That was a predictable cycle, a gift of fertility. While the Hittites and the Mycenaeans were waiting for rain that wouldn't come, Egypt could rely on the Nile. Their farming was just more resilient at its core. A poor flood year was a problem, but it wasn't a death sentence that lasted decades. That gave the state a buffer, a kind of stability that kingdoms depending on rain never had. But even the Nile's gift couldn't stop a deep crisis. Egypt lost its empire in Canaan. Internal splits and economic pressure broke the unity of the new kingdom. The world they knew was over, but they changed. Under Pharaoh Rameses III, they met the storm directly. His temple at Medinet Habu shows a great victory. He fought the Sea Peoples in a huge naval battle right at the Nile's mouth. His archers shot from the shore, his ships locked with the enemy. On land, his infantry and chariots pushed back another invasion at the same time. It was a desperate, brutal defense, and it worked. The invaders were driven back, some settled on the coast, others were beaten. That military success, though, had a staggering price. Fighting a war for survival emptied the royal treasuries. All the gold and grain that used to go to monuments and gifts abroad was spent on soldiers and ships and walls. The victory saved the state, but it broke its spirit. In the years after the cracks started to show, we have the records from Deir el-Medina, the village for the royal tomb workers. These weren't peasants, they were a skilled, state-paid elite, and they went on strike. They put down their tools because their monthly grain was late. They protested at the temples, demanding what was owed to them. A state that can't pay its most essential workers is a state in deep trouble. That institutional decay just spiraled. The very tombs the workers were supposed to build and protect became targets. Tomb robberies became everywhere, a sign of authority collapsing and pure need. The priesthood of Ammon in Thebes grew so powerful they basically ruled Upper Egypt, splitting the pharaoh's power. Egypt survived the cataclysm, but it came out into a smaller age. The confident empire of the Ramesside period faded into political fragments, economic weakness, a loss of control. So Egypt's story finishes the picture. It shows you can be resilient in a systemic collapse, but it's never free. The cost is drained resources, social unrest, a long, slow slide down from what came before. Even the one who made it through the Bronze Age collapse wasn't really a winner, just a survivor marked and changed by it all. The landscape of power had been swept clean. Where there were once sprawling empires connected by royal letters and bronze, now there were only fragments. A world of villages, not palaces. That was the aftermath. A reality defined by what was missing. The great networks were gone, trade collapsed. It went from an international flow down to simple, local barter. A farmer might exchange a few pots for some wool with a neighbor in the next valley. That was the economy, and the knowledge of writing vanished. It vanished with the scribes who served the kings. For centuries in Greece, no one wrote a single word we've found. It was a return to an oral world where memory and story were the only records. This period, especially in Greece, is called the Dark Age. The name fits. The archaeological record grows thin. The population fell dramatically, maybe by as much as 90% in some areas. People retreated from the coasts, from the open plains. They moved into smaller, more defensible hilltop settlements. The grand art of the Mycenaean palaces stopped. The frescoes of chariots and lions, the inlaid daggers, the delicate gold jewelry. All of that stopped. Pottery became simpler, plainer, purely functional. It was a time of cultural retreat, a focusing on sheer survival. Monumental architecture ceased. No one was building cyclopean walls or great beehive tombs. The skills required, the organized labor, the surplus wealth, it had all evaporated. The ruins of the old palaces stood empty on their hills. Massive and mysterious, within a few generations the people living in their shadow had no idea who built them. They became the stuff of legend. The later Greeks would look at the giant stone blocks of Mycenae or Tiryns and believe they were the work of a race of giants. The Cyclopes, the real history of the Wanax and his storerooms, was lost, transformed into the mythic age of heroes described by Homer. Yet within this fragmentation, something new was slowly stirring. The old top-down model had proven catastrophically fragile. Its collapse created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, new forms of community had to be built from the ground up. Without a distant, god-like king demanding tribute, local groups began to govern themselves. They made decisions in council. They organized defense collectively. The scale was small, but the responsibility was direct. This radical simplification, this breaking apart, was ironically the seedbed for a future revolution. Out of these isolated villages, over centuries, new connections would slowly form. Not the imposed unity of an empire, but voluntary alliances between independent communities. They would share a language, a set of stories, a growing sense of shared identity, the political experiment that would eventually emerge from this long, quiet period was the polis. The independent city-state, a model where power was negotiated among citizens, however limited that citizenship was at first. It was a system born from the ashes of centralization. A direct response to the failure of the palace, the Dark Age was not an end. It was a difficult, necessary reset. The next civilization would be built by people who remembered in their bones what happened when all the dominoes fell. The ground shook. It was the final blow for these fragile kingdoms. The archaeological record shows it. At multiple sites you see layers of rubble, walls that fell inward in a specific way. Skeletons found under collapsed ceilings. That points to seismic activity. Earthquakes moving through a region already under stress. A natural disaster on its own might have been something they could rebuild from. But in the late 12th century, it was an accelerant. It turned a crisis into a catastrophe. Think of a society already stretched thin. The population is weakened by famine. Trade has broken down, so there are no materials for repair. The social order is fraying. Then, in a violent tremor, the physical symbols of security are gone. The massive defensive walls of a city like Troy or Mycenaean cracked and toppled. The granaries holding the last stores of grain buried under stone. The palace itself, the seat of authority, reduced to rubble. An earthquake doesn't just destroy buildings, it destroys morale. It shatters the illusion of permanence. For people living on the edge, it could feel like the gods had turned against the ruling order. Recovery needs surplus. It needs coordination and strong leadership. And that's precisely what these collapsing states lacked. A quake could make a city indefensible overnight. Those cracked walls were an open invitation. Neighboring raiders or the desperate groups called the Sea Peoples would see not a fortress but a target, something ripe for plunder. We see this potential convergence at key sites. At Troy, the layer known as Troy 6 shows evidence of violent destruction and fire. But some researchers also see signs of seismic damage there before or during that event. The scenario is plausible. A major quake weakens the city's defenses. In the chaos and vulnerability that follows, attackers see their chance and strike. The result is a destruction layer that blends natural and human violence. Mycenaean shows clues, too. While fire was the ultimate end, some of the foundational damage to its walls aligns with patterns of seismic shock. For the inhabitants, it would have been a world-ending event. The very ground, the one thing that seemed solid, had betrayed them. In a society where the king's power was tied to protection, this was the ultimate failure. It made the impossible task of holding everything together suddenly, physically impossible. This geological factor completes the picture. It wasn't just one thing. It was climate stress leading to famine, famine breaking trade and social trust, broken trade crippling military response, and then, at the worst moment, the literal foundations of cities giving way. Human vulnerability and environmental volatility converged. The earthquakes were the strike of lightning that ignited a landscape already parched and piled high with tinder. They remind us that history isn't just a human story. It's a dialogue with a planet that is never truly still. When a society can't write down what happened, it sings it instead. After everything fell apart, the silence was filled with stories. Those stories grew over generations, told around fires, in the shadow of ruins no one could name anymore. These weren't records, they were something else. They were memory changed by trauma into myth. The great disasters of the Bronze Age didn't just disappear from people's minds. They were boiled down into epic poems, into sacred texts. They didn't keep the facts straight, they kept the feeling of a world coming undone. Take the Trojan War. Homer wrote it down centuries later. On the surface, it's a legend about a siege. A group of Greek kings sails to a rich city in Anatolia, fights for 10 years, wins with a trick. But the feel of the story, it's familiar. It's a story of proud, connected kingdoms. It tells of a great expedition that doesn't end in triumph. It ends in a messy, painful return. The heroes who lived through the war, they come back to find their homes in ruins. Their thrones are gone. Their world is different. The Odyssey isn't about victory. It's about wandering. It's about loss. It's the struggle to find a place in a broken world. That arc, that sense of a golden age followed by a great unraveling, it echoes the real collapse of the Mycenaean world. The epics might be weaving together memories of sea raids, of palaces falling, of a whole connected era that was lost. They're the psychological echo of the dominoes falling. You can hear a similar echo in a different tradition. In the Bible, in the stories of the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan, those texts were written much later. But scholars see something in them. They might hold distant memories of the late Bronze Age upheaval, the story of a people leaving a powerful empire, wandering in hardship, then entering a land of city-states that could reflect the migrations, the power vacuums of that chaotic time. The book of Joshua talks about great walled cities falling. Archaeology doesn't show a single, swift military conquest, but it does show a period, a time of widespread destruction in Canaan. Cities were burned, abandoned, culture changed right during the collapse. These stories might preserve a folk memory of that turbulent shift, of old orders crumbling and new groups finding their place. They frame a time of immense dislocation as a founding journey, an identity forged through trial, and that's the key. These myths aren't history books. They're machines for making meaning. When a civilization gets a shock that deep, like the Bronze Age collapse, the scale of it defies simple explanation. The human mind looks for patterns, for causes, for moral lessons. So chaos becomes a judgment from the gods. Migrations become a promised exodus. The fall of great cities becomes the work of heroes or the will of a god. The stories provide a framework, a way to understand why the world changed. They turn collective trauma into a source of identity, into a purpose for the people who came after. They are the 14th domino, the one made of story, long after the last palace burned, long after the last clay tablet was buried. The emotional truth of the event lived on. It lived in tales of a lost golden age, in sagas of wandering and homecoming, in foundational stories of struggle and arrival. The collapse shattered the physical world of the Bronze Age. But in breaking it, it forced people to tell a new story about themselves, a story that would shape cultures for thousands of years, all of it born from the ashes of a forgotten globalization. The true lesson is in the pattern, not any one event, but the pattern they made. It was a domino effect, a pure one. Each piece that fell, it didn't just stop. It hit the next one. The Bronze Age world was a tightly coupled system, like dominoes standing very close. They were interdependent. The strength of one was tied to the health of all. That connection was what made them prosperous, and it became what made them collapse. When drought hit the Hittite heartland, that was the first domino. Their famine didn't stay put, it pushed people out, refugee flows pressing on their neighbors' borders. That movement was the second domino, the strain of new mouths to feed in places already stressed. And as those places struggled, they couldn't meet their trade obligations. A shipment of grain or copper that a distant kingdom was counting on, it just never arrived. That broken promise was the third domino, a critical exchange that failed. Now the kingdom waiting for that shipment faced a shortage. Its army grew weaker. Its people grew restless. Its own stability began to wobble, and the chain kept going. There was no master villain here, no single invasion that explains it. It was a cascade of failures. Each problem amplified the next. The networks that distributed wealth, they also distributed risk. The trade routes that carried tin and luxury goods, they carried economic shockwaves. The diplomatic marriages that created alliances, they created chains of dependency. The system was so optimized, so efficient under normal conditions. It had no buffers, no shock absorbers. A crisis in one corner could travel through the whole web fast. This model of collapse, it gives us a framework. It's the study of systemic risk. You see it in nature. A forest where every tree is the same species, a single blight can wipe out the whole stand. You see it now in tightly linked financial markets. The failure of one institution can threaten the entire global economy. The Bronze Age kingdoms found out, tragically, that interconnection without resilience is a recipe for catastrophe. Their world was robust until it wasn't, and when it failed everywhere at once. The question their story leaves us with is about our own systems. We live in an age of profound interconnection, just-in-time supply chains, instant communication. Our networks are our strength, but that ancient collapse whispers a warning. It asks us to look at our own dominoes, to see where they're placed too close together, to understand that in a complex system, the greatest threat often isn't the failure of the strongest part. It's the unexpected way a small failure in a weak link can ripple outward, toppling structures we thought were unshakable. Their history is a lesson in humility. Written not by a conqueror but by a cascade, for a long time the story had a villain. It was this idea of a tidal wave, a barbarian horde, the catastrophe model. It was simple, it was dramatic, and for a long time it worked. The ruins were there, the layers of ash. It made sense to point to a single force, the Sea Peoples, to explain how these empires fell in one violent campaign. That narrative gave order to things, a clear cause for a devastating effect. But then archaeology kept going, and the evidence on the ground, it stopped lining up. The destruction wasn't all at once. It happened over decades, over a century even. The pottery styles, the weapons, they were different from one burned city to the next. There was no single invader culture stamped on everything, and at some sites you didn't find signs of a battle. You found empty granaries, abandoned streets. So a different picture started to form, not a sudden murder, a slow, complicated illness. That's where the systems collapse theory came in. It didn't throw out the Sea Peoples. It just repositioned them. They became a symptom of the breakdown, not the cause. Think of a body weakened by a long fever. Its immune system fails. Then a common cold, something it could normally fight off, becomes fatal. The Sea Peoples were that cold. The real disease was the failure of climate, of trade, of social trust. That shift is profound. It moves you from looking for one broken piece to seeing how the whole machine came apart. It asks not who struck the final blow, but why the structure was so vulnerable to a push. The newer evidence tree rings showing megadroughts, sediment cores, economic texts pleading for grain. All of it points to a world buckling under multiple pressures. Pressures that reinforced each other. The invasion theory offered a clean break. The systems collapse theory shows a tragic unraveling. It's a harder truth. Sometimes civilizations aren't murdered. Under the right confluence of stresses, they can just come undone. And that evolution in thought, it mirrors something bigger. About how we understand history, we're learning to sit with complexity, to see the past not as isolated events with lone heroes or villains, but as this dense web. A web of relationships between people and their environment. It's a more challenging story to tell, but in its intricate, domino-falling reality, it might be the one that truly holds a mirror to our own age. To how fragile it all is, how interconnected. We know this from fragments. It's a puzzle. Modern archaeology works like a detective story, using science to read what's left behind. The first clue came from trees, not carvings, the trees themselves. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating. You study the rings in ancient timber. A wide ring means a wet year. A narrow ring means drought. The patterns from oaks in bogs, pines in ruins, they tell the same story. Starting around 1250 BC, the rings get tight. For generations, that's the Megadrought, the environmental backdrop. It's physical proof written in wood. Then there are shipwrecks, time capsules on the seafloor. The Uluburun wreck off Turkey, found by a sponge diver in the 1980s. It's a snapshot of Bronze Age trade. Underwater archaeologists mapped its cargo. 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, a ton of tin, ebony, ivory, glass, amber, a gold scarab with Queen Nefertiti's name. This one ship connects Egypt, the Aegean, the Near East, even the Baltic. It shows the reach of that world, the interdependence, and its violent end, sinking with all that wealth, hints at the danger. The seas weren't always safe even then. On land, the clues get more subtle. Scientists use residue analysis on pottery. Take a shard from a storage jar. Use chemistry to detect what was inside centuries ago. Traces of wine, olive oil, resins. Match these chemical signatures across sites, and you can map trade routes that left no writing. You can trace a jar of olive oil from a Mycenaean palace to a town in the Levant. This invisible evidence shows how everyday goods moved along the same routes as royal gifts. Putting the pieces together falls to scholars who work as synthesizers. Historians like Eric Cline, the late Robert Drews, they didn't just dig, they gathered tree ring data, archaeological reports from a dozen countries, translated tablets, climate models. They looked for patterns in the chaos. Their work shifted the story from simple invasion to systemic collapse. They showed how drought evidence from Turkey aligned with Hittite pleas for grain. How shipwreck cargoes illustrated trade that later vanished. How destruction layers in city after city weren't identical, but formed a wave of failure over decades. This detective work makes a point. History isn't a static list from one book. It's an ongoing investigation. Each new technology, each fresh dig, each dataset can refine the picture. Sometimes it overturns what we thought. The Bronze Age collapse is an example. Evidence on the ground forced a complete rethink, moving from a theory of a single murder to an understanding of a prolonged unraveling. The past isn't dead, it's waiting, in tree rings, pottery shards, silent ship holes, for us to learn how to listen. Not every domino fell the same way. Empires were crumbling, but one island held on. It even found a way to thrive. Cyprus, a Lashia to the ancients. It was the copper heart of the Bronze Age world. Its fate is different, a story of survival. Of transformation, the archaeological record shows the major Cypriot cities, in Komi and Kishon, they did suffer destruction. They burned, just like Ugarit. Like Hattusa, but the crucial difference is the destruction wasn't the end. It was a brutal reset. Within a generation or two, these sites were rebuilt. Not as copies, as something new. New city layouts appeared. New pottery styles emerged with bold designs, animals, ships. A vibrant, distinct Cypriot culture began to flourish, right in the ashes of the old order. So why did Cyprus manage this when others vanished? Geography was key. An island is a natural fortress. The sea provided a buffer. It filtered out the mass migrations, the land-based raids that overwhelmed the continental powers. An invading force needed ships that filtered out the desperate, land-bound groups. It gave Cyprus an advantage, time and space to reorganize, but the real secret was copper. The demand for bronze didn't disappear with the palaces. It just changed. The great kings were gone, but people still needed tools. Warriors still needed weapons. The centralized trade networks had shattered, but local exchange continued. Cyprus still had the primary ingredient. Its copper was now more valuable than ever. Because the old, easy sources of tin and copper were gone, The island adapted its economy. It became a hub for a new, decentralized metal trade. Archaeologists find Cypriot copper ingots in the southern Levant from this period. New trade routes were forming, bypassing the old imperial centers. The islanders didn't just sell raw material, they became sophisticated metal workers. Producing finished goods for export, this economic pivot fueled a cultural renaissance. The art that emerged is telling. Those new pottery styles often show ships. They celebrate seafaring, trade, movement. It's the imagery of a people confident on the water, masters of their primary means of connection. They were building an identity. Not as a subject of a distant king, but as a crucial node in a new, networked world. Cyprus shows that collapse isn't a uniform event, it's a landscape. Some valleys are buried, some hills remain. The island's story is resilience through adaptation. It took the most valuable piece of the old system, its copper, and learned how to market it in a fractured world. It reassembled the fragments into a new pattern. In the midst of a dark age, Cyprus became a beacon, proving that when dominoes fall, the pieces can be picked up. Used to build something unexpected, languages are living things and they can be lost. After everything fell apart, one of the great voices from that ancient world just went quiet. Hittite, it was the language of an empire, of treaties, of royal decrees, and then it was gone. No one spoke it. The writing, those cuneiform marks on clay, they just became scratches. Something you couldn't read. That's more than a language changing. It's a whole way of seeing the world, a way of ordering reality that ends. And when something like that vanishes, that space doesn't stay empty. New sounds move in. Across the Levant, that coastal strip, the map of peoples gets redrawn. You see it in the archaeology, at places like Ashkelon, Ekron. There's a sudden shift. A new kind of pottery appears. The style is completely foreign. It's not the refined work from the Canaanite cities. This looks like something from the Aegean. Handmade, decorated with these bold, geometric patterns, stylized birds, and you find new habits alongside it, a taste for pork which wasn't common there. New layouts for buildings, it's the footprint of a new people settling in. The Bible, Egyptian records, they give a name for them, the Philistines. Most scholars now see them as part of those groups called the Sea Peoples. And they weren't just raiders, they were settlers. Their arrival in all that chaos planted a new cultural seed. It would shape the region for centuries. Their name itself would echo, giving us the word Palestine. This whole period, this upheaval, it was a forge, a place where identity got made. With the great empires gone, the old hierarchies just melted away. And in the highlands of Canaan, away from the coast, another new identity was coming together. Small, tribal communities. They lived in simple villages, no walls. Their pottery was plain, utilitarian. They didn't eat pork. Over time, these groups developed a distinct sense of themselves. They would tell stories. Stories of an exodus, of a covenant, framing their origins in the turbulent journey of this very era. They would become Israel. Their language, Hebrew, would carry their stories and laws. It would survive millennia to become a modern tongue. That birth was made possible by the collapse. The old order had to fall apart. On the coast, something else was taking root. In cities like Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, the Canaanite inhabitants didn't vanish, they adapted. With the great powers gone, they turned to the sea fully. They became the Phoenicians, masters of shipbuilding, of navigation. They didn't build a land empire, they built a commercial network, a web of trade colonies stretching across the Mediterranean. And they gave the world one of its most profound gifts, an alphabet, a simple, accessible set of consonants pulled from earlier scripts. It was a tool for merchants, for record keeping, but that innovation would get adapted by the Greeks, becoming the ancestor of the very letters we use now. The Iron Age world that came out of the Bronze Age rubble, it wasn't a poor copy. It was a new experiment, a world of smaller states, often fiercely independent. Nations like Israel, Judah, Aram, Damascus, the Phoenician city-states. Their conflicts, their alliances, they fill the pages of new historical records, and their languages, Aramaic, Hebrew, Phoenician, they became vehicles. For commerce, for scripture, for diplomacy, Aramaic would even become the administrative language for future empires, so the collapse was this violent and creative crucible. It didn't just destroy, it cleared the ground, it broke the monopoly of that old power, the palace-centered, bronze-dependent system. In that fractured landscape, new peoples could find a place. New ideas could take root. The old, interconnected system was gone, but from its pieces, the seeds of the classical world were sown. The end of one age is always the beginning of another. A difficult, messy beginning. That interdependence, the dominoes falling in sequence, it's not just a thing of the past. We're inside a system now, one we built ourselves. And it mirrors the Bronze Age, really, in its complexity and in its fragility. Our world is woven together by these supply chains that circle the globe. A single critical component, a semiconductor chip, might travel across 3 continents before it ends up in a final product. This network gives us incredible efficiency. Abundance, but it creates a vulnerability, a drought in Taiwan or a political dispute, a pandemic that shuts down ports. Any one of those can ripple outward. It causes shortages, cars, appliances, medical equipment, thousands of miles away. Just like the Hittites depended on grain from Egypt, we depend on this steady, uninterrupted flow of goods from places we may never see. And then there's the pressure from a changing climate. It's a slow-moving stressor, but its effects are accelerating. We see megadroughts returning in some regions. Unprecedented floods in others. It disrupts agriculture. It displaces communities. These aren't sudden invasions. They're creeping, systemic pressures. They strain resources, fuel migration, challenge the stability of nations. Like that ancient drought that baked the fields of Anatolia, modern climate shifts test our global food systems. They test our political will to cooperate, and beneath all that, geopolitical tensions simmer, alliances shift, trade agreements get renegotiated. The language of diplomacy grows strained. It echoes the silence that eventually fell between the kings of Hittite and Egypt. The cooperative frameworks we have, the ones that manage shared crises from public health to financial stability, they require constant maintenance. They require trust, and trust is a resource that can be depleted as quickly as any grain store. So the question comes out of the dust of 3,000 years. Are we repeating the pattern? The lesson of the Bronze Age collapse isn't that we're doomed. It's a warning about the fragility of hyper-efficient, tightly coupled systems. It teaches that resilience isn't about building higher walls. It's about creating buffers, creating alternatives, diversifying our sources of energy, of critical materials, strengthening local capacities alongside global trade, and most crucially, nurturing the international cooperation we need to manage the crises no single nation can solve alone. Their story is a mirror held up to our own interconnected age, asking us to see the dominoes we've so carefully stood upright, and to consider how we might space them just a little farther apart. The cost of that collapse wasn't just broken walls, it was silence, what wasn't made anymore. The big frescoes, the bulls and dolphins, they stopped. The gold work, the seals, the huge statues of gods and kings. That production ended, and this was more than an economy failing. It was a cultural pullback, a deep psychological shift for the people who made it through. When each day is about finding food and staying safe, the energy for high art, for writing poetry or building temples to beauty, it just goes away. The human spirit turns inward. It focuses on the bare minimum of survival. That's the mindset of a dark age, a collective trauma that resets what matters for generations. You see it in what's left behind. The pottery gets plainer, just functional. The designs, if there are any, they're simpler. The elaborate scenes of ceremonies and processions are gone. Instead, you might see a few geometric lines, maybe a spiral. The artistic vocabulary gets smaller, and it mirrors a world that's become smaller itself, more isolated, more focused on the immediate. Losing literacy was a catastrophe for historical memory, but it also changed how people thought. Without writing, you can't run complex administration. You can't record nuanced philosophy or layered history. Memory becomes oral, and oral tradition values different things. It values rhythm, repetition, memorable characters, clear moral lessons. Stories get streamlined into archetypes, so the complicated history of a failed Wanax and his grain stores becomes the legend of a fallen hero king. The chaotic migrations of many different groups become the epic journey of one single people. That simplification had a psychological purpose. In a shattered world, these stories were anchors. They made identity from chaos. They offered reasons for all the suffering people went through, often saying it was a test from the gods or a punishment for old sins. The trauma of the collapse was metabolized into myth. The oral traditions that came out of it, they weren't trying to be accurate history books. They were tools for survival. Tools to hold a community together, to teach its values, to make sense of a cosmos that had shown it could break. This cultural retreat, this long turning inward, it was a profound human cost. A cost measured in lost potential, in beautiful things that were never created, in complex ideas that were never written down and argued over, in scientific observations that were never recorded and built upon. For centuries, the light of inquiry and artistic ambition burned very low, kept only in the most protected places. The collective mind of the survivor societies was marked by a deep caution, a focus on the local and the known, a hesitation to build anything too grand or make connections too wide. They had learned, in the most visceral way, that such ambitions could end in ashes. The legacy of that lesson would last long after the last city burned, shaping the cautious first steps of the world that would slowly, tentatively, rise from the silence. Prosperity can drain the land's strength. The Bronze Age's success, those cities, those armies needed raw materials. It needed fuel. To smelt bronze, you need charcoal. To fire pottery, to heat homes, you need wood. That demand led to deforestation. Across the eastern Mediterranean, hillsides were stripped, trees went to feed the forges. And agriculture expanded too, more land cleared for fields. It wasn't malicious, it was logical, it was growth, but it set a long-term trap, environmental overshoot. That's when a society's demand on its land slowly exceeds what the land can give. The environment's ability to regenerate forests growing back, soil staying fertile, falls behind the pace of use. A civilization in flourishing can undermine its own foundation. For the Bronze Age, this created a hidden vulnerability. A landscape without trees changes everything. Forests act like a sponge. Their roots hold soil. They help regulate local rain. They buffer against erosion. Without them, the land becomes fragile. Heavy rains wash away topsoil. The ground becomes less fertile. The local climate can become drier, more extreme. So when the larger megadrought arrived, and the tree rings show it did, these societies stood on weakened ground. Their environments had lost resilience. They had less buffer against a major shock. The evidence for this specific domino is debated. It's harder to see than a burned city. But the principle is instructive. It shifts perspective from a short-term crisis to a long-term relationship. Civilizations aren't separate from their ecosystems. They're embedded in them. That initial Bronze Age prosperity, driven by innovation, may have used up some of the land's natural capital. It traded long-term stability for short-term growth. This doesn't mean collapse was an inevitable punishment for cutting trees. It means the environmental stresses of drought and famine hit societies already ecologically stressed. Their margin for error had been shrinking for generations. It's a lesson in balance. True resilience isn't just strong walls or full storehouses. It's also about maintaining the health of the systems that provide the walls and fill the storehouses. A society's greatest strength and its greatest weakness might be written in the soil beneath its feet, in the trees on its horizons. The king's army wasn't the only force that mattered anymore. The great empires were dissolving, and the professional soldiers who served them, they were adrift. Their loyalty had been to the palace, to the regular grain ration, the bronze. But the palace was gone, the rations stopped. These trained warriors, masters of the chariot and spear, they had to find a new way to survive, so they became a commodity. Their skill in violence was now for sale, to whoever could pay. That shift created something new in the chaos. The privatization of force. Military power wasn't a state monopoly anymore, because the state itself was often just a memory. Now it was a service offered by armed bands moving through the fractured landscape. They were freelancers, mercenaries. Their allegiance was temporary. A contract, a promise of plunder that made the world after the collapse far more volatile. You couldn't negotiate peace with a kingdom because there often wasn't a single authority. Instead, you faced roaming companies of fighters, motivated by survival and profit, with little interest in rebuilding the old order. They thrived in the vacuum. There's a famous example in the Egyptian records. Among the groups they called the Sea Peoples were the Shurden. In the battle scenes at Medinet Habu, they're shown fighting against Rameses III. Horned helmets, round shields. But then, just a few decades later, you find Shurden warriors serving as elite guards in the pharaoh's own army. They went from being the ultimate outsiders to being part of the last standing state's security. That tells us a lot. These groups weren't a monolithic barbarian horde. They were professional fighters. Their services could be hired. If one kingdom fell, they'd offer their swords to another. Or if no one would hire them, they might just take what they needed. Their presence accelerated the cycle. A band of mercenaries hired by a city to defend it might, if the pay was late, decide to sack the city instead. The tool used to create stability could become the source of more instability. This erosion of a state's monopoly on violence, it's a classic symptom of collapse. When the central authority can no longer pay or protect or command, the means of coercion slip away. Local strongmen raise their own bands. Warlords control small territories. Order fragments into a patchwork, competing armed interests. Rebuilding a unified kingdom becomes a monumental task because you have to first defeat or buy off dozens of these small, mobile powers. Each with its own agenda. The rise of the mercenary was a consequence of the collapse and a reason it was so hard to reverse. It turned military power into a market. And in a starving, desperate world, that market was always open. A king's divinity is fragile. When the rains don't come, when the granaries go empty, when invaders break through walls that were supposed to last forever, people look to their ruler. They look to the one who's meant to be the bridge to the gods, and they see failure. But this was more than politics. This was the cosmic order breaking. The palace wasn't just where administration happened. It was the axis mundi, the point where heaven met earth. The king's rituals made the seasons turn. They made the Nile flood, the crops grow. His success meant the gods were pleased, so his failure, that was a terrifying sign. It meant the gods had turned away. Or maybe that they were powerless. The ideological foundations of the Bronze Age crumbled right along with the walls, temples. The houses of the divine, they weren't spared either. They were looted for their precious metals. Their statues of gods were stolen or defaced. In some places, they were just abandoned. The silence in a temple is a profound silence. It's the sound of prayers no longer being offered. If a god couldn't protect his own house, how could he protect the city? That spiritual vacuum left a space. A painful, empty space, and in that space, new understandings of the divine could start to form. After the collapse, the relationship between people and the powers they worshipped began to change. The old model was transactional. It was collective. The king, as high priest, performed the rites for the whole kingdom. The people's piety was mediated through the state. But when the state collapsed, that mediation broke. Individuals, smaller communities, they had to reckon with the divine on their own terms. You can see the seeds of this shift in the early Hebrew traditions that came together in the Iron Age. Their foundational stories, written down later, reflect a radically different idea. The covenant wasn't with a king. It was directly between a deity and a people. A personal, moral contract. It emphasized ethical conduct, social justice, fidelity. This was a religion that could survive without a palace, without a centralized temple for centuries. It was portable. Its God wasn't tied to a specific mountain or a city that could be conquered. He was a God of history, a God of journey. This didn't happen overnight. It was a slow cultural adaptation, a response to a world where the old guarantors of cosmic order had proven false. The trauma of the collapse forced a profound theological question. If the king isn't divine, if the temple can fall, where does meaning reside? The answers that emerged across different cultures in that long recovery, they tended to move inward. Toward personal responsibility, toward a divine relationship based on law and ethical choice, rather than solely on ritual and royal intercession. The collapse didn't just destroy economies. It challenged the stories civilizations told themselves about why the world worked, and from that broken cosmology, new stories had to be born, more resilient ones. The Dark Age wasn't just silence, it was a forge, and from that long isolation, something new was formed. The polis, the city-state, that's the world of classical Greece. Athens, Sparta, philosophers, playwrights, and that world exists because of the unraveling, because when the palaces fell, the old way was discredited. The model of the god-king, the centralized bureaucracy, it had failed. The people rebuilding over centuries, village by village, they weren't trying to bring back a Wanax. They were building from the ground up. Their communities were smaller, tighter. They had to be self-reliant. They had to decide for themselves about defense, about justice, about survival. And that radical self-sufficiency, that became the seed of citizenship, the idea that the community belonged to its members, that they had a voice in its fate, even if it was limited at first. The collapse broke the monopoly on power. It created a blank slate, 1,000 blank slates across the Aegean, and on those slates people began to experiment. Rule by committee, written laws, the concept of civic freedom. The political imagination of the classical world came from the necessity of that reality. After the collapse, even the stories that held the Greeks together were shaped by the trauma. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and Odyssey, they weren't history. But they were memory, transformed by centuries of telling. They described a heroic age, great kings, magnificent palaces, grand expeditions. For the Greeks listening in the 8th century, the ruins of Mycenae and Pylos weren't just old stones. They were proof of that lost world. Homer gave them a glorious past, a shared ancestry of heroes, and he gave them a cautionary tale. The heroes' homecomings were often disastrous. Kingdoms were lost, order was overturned. The epics carried the echo of a civilization that flew too high and fell. This shared cultural bedrock, this sense of a glorious but tragic past, it unified the fragmented Greek world. It gave them a common language of values and identity, all of it distilled from the hazy memory of the collapse. Then look ahead to the world Rome would eventually dominate. The map of the first millennium BC was a map the collapse had drawn. The powerful Bronze Age empires were gone. In their place was a mosaic of smaller, competing states. The Phoenician city-states, masters of trade, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Aramean states, This fractured landscape of the eastern Mediterranean, this was the world early Greek colonists and Roman traders would engage with. The collapse had cleared the field of monolithic superpowers. It created a dynamic, competitive arena, a place where new ideas about commerce, warfare, statecraft could clash and merge. The philosophy of Greece, the legal genius of Rome, these weren't inevitable. They were the fruits of a specific historical garden, a garden that had been plowed under by the disasters of the 12th century BC. So the long shadow of the collapse isn't just destruction, it's the shadow of a reset, a violent, painful pruning, and that pruning allowed for hardier, more adaptable forms of political and cultural life to take root. To eventually bloom, the world of Socrates and Cicero stood unknowingly on the foundation of that ancient failure. History rarely gives us a perfect ending. Even with all the evidence we've pieced together, the story of the Bronze Age collapse is still full of shadows. There are gaps, moments where the light just fades, and questions are left there haunting the record. And these aren't minor details, they're fundamental mysteries. They remind you the map of the past is still being drawn. Take a single city, a critical one. Ugarit, we know it was destroyed. We found its last plea for help still unsent in a kiln. But what happened that final day? Was it dawn or was it night? A surprise attack, or had a siege been going for weeks? The ash layer shows the end, but it doesn't show the frantic, human decisions in the hours before. At Mycenaean, the fire was so intense it baked administrative tablets, but we don't know if that fire was set by invaders at the gate, or by an internal revolt, or even by accident, just chaos. The precise choreography at each site, it's still a puzzle. Then there are the invisible forces. We talk about famine, conflict, but disease could have been a silent partner. Epidemic illness leaves few traces in bones 3,000 years old. A pandemic sweeping through populations already weakened. It could have been a devastating multiplier, crippling the ability to resist or to rebuild. It's a haunting possibility, difficult to prove but impossible to dismiss, especially with all that movement, all that disruption. Some mysteries follow entire peoples. The Hittite royal family just vanishes after the fall of Hattusa. The tablets stop. The line of great kings who once wrote to pharaohs as brothers disappears. Did they perish in the collapse? Did they flee east, try to set up a rump state only to be absorbed? Or did they scatter, their identity dissolving into the migrations of the age? The end of their story is a profound silence. Other questions are about connections we can't quite see. The identity of the groups called the Sea Peoples is still debated. We have the names from Egyptian inscriptions, the Peliset, the Denyon, the Shekelesh. We can match some, like the Peliset, to the Philistines, but for others, their origins, their destinations, it's all speculative. They moved across the stage in a dramatic, violent moment, and then they were gone, absorbed or transformed. These open questions, they aren't failures of scholarship. They're the engine of it. They drive new excavations, new scientific techniques on old bones and seeds, new readings of weathered inscriptions. Every season in the field could turn up a tablet that changes the timeline, or a genetic analysis that shows unexpected movements. That's what makes history a living field, not a closed book. The Bronze Age collapse isn't a solved case. It's an ongoing investigation. The fact we're still asking these questions, still peering into the dust for clues, it speaks to the enduring power of this ancient catastrophe. It reminds you the past isn't a static diorama, it's a conversation where each new discovery asks you to listen again, to reconsider the story you thought you knew. The mysteries are an invitation to wonder, to explore, and to stay humble before that immense, complicated tapestry of human experience. That symphony of failure, it reached its final chord. The Bronze Age empires collapsed, and that collapse is one of history's clearest lessons in fragility, how things are connected. It wasn't one event. It wasn't one cause, it was a cascade: climate change, famine, trade routes breaking down, people moving, revolts inside the palaces. Each one was a domino. And each domino that fell made the next collapse not just possible, but inevitable. The historian Nancy Sanders called it the first and most spectacular example of civilization's vulnerability. The first time humanity had built something that vast, that connected, that seemed permanent, and then they watched it unravel completely. The lesson isn't doom. It's awareness, seeing the architecture of a system. Our world today, we're linked by threads, more threads and faster than any ancient king could imagine. Our supply chains, our digital networks, our global climate, it's a web of stunning complexity, and complexity can hide fragility. So understanding how systems fail, how stress moves through a network, that's not about predicting an end. It's the first step, the step toward building something better. Systems with buffers, with redundancies, with the resilience to bend and not break. This ancient story is a mirror. A chance to look back and see a pattern that whispers